OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the map is indestructible, part 2. We've talked about Gödel, incompleteness theorem, Korzybski, science and sanity, and now we're going to be talking more on Barfield and Leibniz. And the paper is arguing that there is reason to think that reality fundamentally entails situation, relation, and things that, if the case, mean that we require a new symbolic and a map in the first place. And if this is the case, then we can't function without maps, and so in that sense the map is indestructible. And then also the map is indestructible in that if we try to undermine it, we can always find points of incompletion that we can quilt into its essential character, thus not necessarily undermining it, thinking of Mr. Gödel. Now, maybe reality isn't in some way fundamentally relational or dialectical, not that those are necessarily the same, or situational. There are various ontological and metaphysical schemas that would suggest we really cannot avoid the problem of maps and consistency to understand reality. We can't have a formal system, as Gödel tried to pointed out, and we can't have arithmetic versus geometry points, or a understanding of reality that does not have an observer involved. And that being the case, we're always dealing with consistency that may not be correspondence, which leads to a need for the art of maps, the art of being human, which if we don't take seriously, we could be in trouble. And Korzybski believed that our inability to develop a symbolic that made situation, relation, and so on central, AB, as Hegel would put in the Science of Logic, and certainly Hegel aligns with all of this. If we did not do this, we would continue to see quote-unquote insanity. These mass political movements, totalitarianism, etc., so forth. But it really does matter what symbolic we have. Korzybski says now it's perfectly clear that all of the things with which human beings have to deal, the most important by far is man himself, humankind, men, women, and children. And yet we have a very poor understanding of what is man. We find ourselves asking all the way back from Socrates, what am I? Know thyself. And this seems like impossible. And yet if we don't know ourselves, how can we know anything? And so there's a weird way in which we need a symbolic, a logic of which that makes part of its very character and quality the realization that we don't know what we are, that we're always passing over into otherness. Now, to say we don't know what we are is to say that identification, the equal sign, is not possible. This does not mean no knowledge is possible, but we need a symbolic that makes the options not between certainty and nihilism, epistemic nihilism. That's a point that Newbegin warned about. We need a symbolic that makes confidence in epistemological accomplishment, but we don't have that. And what does that even mean? What does it mean to have a logic that passes over into otherness, AB? Well, that's the project of Hegel, and Korzybski understands that being very, very important. And Korzybski also makes this interesting point when he says, when lightning struck a house, this is far in the past, the population naturally made no attempt to save the house or anything in it, because to do so would be against the definition which proclaims the phenomenon to be a punishment for evil. Any attempt to prevent or check the destruction would be an impious act. The sinner would be guilty of resisting the supreme law and would deserve to be punished by death. So if you believe that lightning was from the gods and that a house struck by lightning was punishment from the gods, then to try to save the house or put out the fire would be immoral. And what Korzybski is trying to point out is that how we view the world organizes our values. There's the opening paper, The Conflict of Mind, says the truth organizes values. What we believe is true organizes what we think we should do. And so what we believe is true, what we believe is possible, will organize what is epistemically responsible, to reference Clifford, what we think is good activity afterwards. So it's really important to understand what is true. Well, here's the rub. The map isn't the territory, so the only way to know what is true is according to a map that isn't the truth. And yet that in of itself as a whole is the truth by which we need to organize values. The truth is the map isn't the territory, and so we need to behave and organize our activity with that essential incompleteness part of our system. You could easily argue this is the entire project of Hegel, and basically Korzybski is making the same claim, and the project of the truism of the rational is to think, what does it mean to think responsibly, or to think well, or to coordinate values when incompleteness needs to be central to our system. Now, incompleteness is not nihilism, nor is the incompleteness of space the same as the incompletion of time. Those are points in the book, The Absolute Choice. But there is a fundamental break, a split that has to be taken seriously. And that also points ahead to Zizek. But, Korzybski also, interesting enough, he'll talk about chemistry binding as plants, space binding creatures, and time binding as humans. So he's talking about these different ways that we can think about what is the human versus the animal. And he does think humans are different from animals because we can bind time. We have memories, we can see time together, whereas animals are more spatial. And if we think humans are just animals, then to his point from a moment ago, we won't have the right truth by which to organize our values. And he wants to make temporality central because he thinks that is, as time binding entities, we need a temporal logic. And we really don't have a temporal logic. We have a spatial logic, or we don't have an unfolding becoming logic. We have a spatial. Well, again, this is Hegel's AB versus AA. This is the science of logic. So he really wants to emphasize humans as time-binding entities. And if we don't do that, we will be in trouble. And then he has this nice line where he says, it is the counsel of wisdom, according to Korzybski, to discover the laws of nature, including the law of human nature, and then to live in accordance with them. The opposite is folly. Well, human beings is time binding, so what does it mean to figure out the laws of time, the logic of time? And what's very interesting is, since time is unfolding, it's not something you can finish. That means you have to have a certain incomplete logic. And it also means, if time is the territory and is changing, you're always dealing with a map. You always are dealing with a map that then, funny enough, has to be updated relative to the ways that the territory changes. And again, this gets back to Hegel. But we have to think about logic far more temporally. There's a lot of space, but we really need to think about time. And again, a way to put it is that if we have an overly logical or spatial time, then it's not going to align with how the human nervous system, Korzybski talks a lot about nervous system, which is very temporal. We're not going to align with that, and that's going to cause all sorts of issues. So again, if we're not careful, we're going to end up in a lot of trouble, basically not aligning how it is the human operates in the world with how the human thinks about the world. We'll have a map even if we don't realize it, and in not realizing it and not being able to adjust or to pivot in the ways that the map doesn't equal the territory, we're going to be in trouble. It should also be noted a few things. Matt Segal writes a lot on Whitehead. Whitehead sees the universe as, you could almost say, a capital C, creative unfolding. I don't mean that in a Platonic way. I just mean that reality is fundamentally creative. I think what Whitehead is saying, and maybe Schelling, aligns with the kind of world that Korzybski is saying we need. He's just focused more on the logic and the semantics versus, say, the metaphysics. I think that is also the case. Then we can start to think about Korzybski also suggesting that we need to update logic for the sake of sanity. If, say, if the relational, the transcendental, the emergentism of Vervaeke, Henriquez, Barfield, if these people are correct, then we certainly do not have a logic that aligns us with actuality. A great example of this is the great Owen Barfield, and I had a wonderful talk with Matt Segal about this. His famous example of saving the appearances, where he asks, what if reality is more like a rainbow than we realize? Which is to say, a rainbow is not an illusion. A rainbow is something that many people, a shared representation, many people can observe who just share the conditions. If you're in the sunlight, if you're in the rain, if you're in the right place at the right time, you'll see a rainbow. And Barfield simply asks, we know, given quantum mechanics and science, that the observer, seems to play a big role. You can think the vertical causation of Wolfgang Smith. The observer seems to play a big role in how reality unfolds. Well, what if, all of reality is more like a rainbow than we realize, that there really aren't things but relations that are being participated in, that relations are primary in some way. He actually kind of fascinatingly suggests that thinghood is a certain idolatry. If you start saying that things have their own being, there's a kind of idolatry in that, which is pretty fascinating. But anyway, Barfield is suggesting that reality might have a certain observer conditionalism that is part of it. Well, that right there means we need an A-B logic. We need a new logic. And certainly Korzybski talks all the time about relations and processes. I don't think he'd have any problem with what Owen Barfield is putting forth. Also, I would note, I can't help but talk about the topic of monads in Leibniz that the great Austin Farah elucidates in the preface to one of Leibniz's book, Theocracy on the Problem of Evil. And the monad, I think, what Austin Farah wants us to think is that for Leibniz, you can't think anything without representation. Even if you try to think of the universe without observers or humans who can subjectively represent reality, that's a representation to yourself. So all stages of reality, all considerations of it have some sort of representation. And even if you have, rocks touching, there's a way in which the rocks represent reality to themselves as spatial and unconscious. You'd say it's meaningless, but there's a way in which the rock represents the universe as a rock, and it represents the rest of the universe according to its conditionality. Again, you can say that's meaningless and unconscious and whatever, but Leibniz would suggest that at all points of reality there is some mode of representation, and representation is not merely sight. You represent a certain mode of being, a monad, a mode. I think monad and mode sound similar for a reason. So the rock represents a certain mode. The flower represents a certain mode of being. Maybe it's the chemistry binding, as Korzybski says. And it represents reality to itself according to that chemistry binding. And the human represents reality temporally and experiences things temporally, maybe like the rainbow. And here's the point. I think we need to think of the Leibniz monad as the smallest possible situation that is characterized by a distinct membrane of representation, or as a distinct range of representation. And you can say there are millions upon millions of monads because there are millions upon millions of distinct representations of reality. But it's not an atom. What atoms are to things, monads are to situation. And the smallest possible point in reality is a situation, a mode, a range of representation, a relation, you could say. So the reason why this is important is because if Leibniz is correct, and we're always dealing with situation, well, right there, that means the map is indestructible because there are never things, there are only situations. I think the monad, a way to think about it is like a monad for a plant is a range of chemistry binding, like Korzybski says. For a human is time binding. And there are different monads because there are different bindings. And then between the different kinds of monads, there can be millions upon millions of different smaller monads for each individual plant, each human being. And that doesn't mean everyone is in a different universe, because everyone is representing in and of the same universe. This isn't a multiverse thing. We could say that in a way, Leibniz is not supporting some panpsychism, almost like a pan-representationism, is that everything that exists as a range of representation of the universe to itself and as itself, because humans are the universe. We are nature. We're part of nature. It's not that we're in nature. We are the cosmos in nature. That's something like Benito Roy will emphasize. I don't think Leibniz would have a problem with that at all. And we can kind of say that every monad is its unique shared representation, like a rainbow. It's like if you meet certain conditions, you represent reality to yourself and as yourself, just like the experience of the rainbow. There's a certain unique condition that has to be met to experience the rainbow. Likewise, there's a unique condition that has to be met to have X monad versus Y monad. You may need the human nervous system, born in 1998, and you're good at athletics, and there's a certain way, because your body thinks different as a good athlete than someone who isn't a good athlete. There's a different way you represent nature, and that nature is represented to you. So the monad is a mode of representation. It is the smallest possible, and the monads can relate and inform one another, but every monad and range of representation is unique to itself, and through which it experiences and sees the world. And by sees, that means experiences, because you don't have to necessarily see. I find this understanding, which I think Austin Farrer brings out, of thinking about the monad very, very useful. And I think if it is true that the monad is in fact the smallest possible unit of reality, not the atom, then again, we are always dealing with maps. We are always dealing with situations. And if that's the case, then the question is, what is the character of that situation? What generates that situation? Is there some sort of fundamental break in it, some sort of dialectical materialism, some sort of real that Zizek and Lacan will talk about that follows from everything being situation, that then maps may help us live with and come to terms with, and that would get us into Zizek and then ultimately Thomas Pynchon as further reason to think that the map is indestructible, in addition to the fact that the smallest possible unit of reality could be a situation, ergo a territory. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. You can find part 1 on Medium, Substack. There's an audio review, and you can find the books on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are a massive help, and thank you so much for your time.